Thank you for coming back. I appreciate it. And I want to thank my commentators today in advance for being here and, coming back. They might have said, no, I'm not. Thank you, Nico, for my introduction. I want to begin by saying that our aim in this lecture is to consider some positive proposals that explain why it is at least thought to be permissible to harm some to save others in the basic trolley cases discussed in Lecture 1. Now, how many people were here for Lecture 1? All right. Who wasn't here for Lecture 1? Okay. So I'm just going to do a brief review of Lecture 1 for some people. You all have a handout? Okay. So the basic trolley cases discussed in Lecture 1 involved, first of all, one involving a trolley driver and another a mere bystander. Recall that the classic trolley case, as represented in Diagram 1, which is just a repetition. Those of you who were here on yesterday saw this diagram already. It involves a driver in a trolley whose brake does not work when the trolley is headed toward killing 5 people on the track. And that line across the arrow leading to the 5 just represents the trolley, that arrow, minimalist diagram. The driver can only stop this by diverting to another track where the trolley will foreseeably kill one other person. For the driver, it is said, it is a choice between killing 5 and killing 1. That's the way a lot of people see this. The basic bystander case involves the same trolley when the driver is unable to do anything, but a mere bystander who's at a switch on the side can divert the trolley, killing the one other person on the side track. So we can use the same diagram, only just, imagine that there are these 2 options, but not for the driver, but for the bystander. All right. So for the bystander, however, the choice is between letting 5 die, because he didn't start any trolley, he's not driving any trolley, or killing that one person when he diverts. In Lecture 1, I considered Judith Thomson's view that whether killing one by turning the trolley is permissible depends on who turns the trolley. She thinks, at least in the 2008 article that I discussed, that the driver may permissibly turn the trolley because it is his only way of not committing the greater wrong of killing 5 people. Indeed, he has a duty to turn that trolley. I had 2 major concerns about this view of Thomson's. First, it does not explain, I find that it didn't explain why the driver may kill one person by turning the trolley, but not by toppling someone from a bridge so that his body falls in front of the trolley and the weight of this very heavy person would stop the trolley or redirect it. So you have Diagram 3. I'll come back to 2. Diagram 3 represents this toppling case. The driver is not pushing anybody. He's just pressing a switch. Instead of diverting, what he can do is he can press the switch and topple someone from the bridge in front of the trolley. And I didn't think that that was permissible even for the driver. Second, I was not convinced that someone who would otherwise only let 5 die might not be permitted to do what someone who would otherwise kill the 5 was permitted to do. Though I was willing to accept that only the person who would otherwise kill could be obligated to turn the trolley. Okay? Now, at the end of the first lecture, I suggested that if both the driver and the bystander are permitted, at the very least, to turn the trolley, but neither may do certain other things that would save 5 people and kill another person, let's say like toppling that person off the bridge, then the trolley problem that I see it myself as left with is about why it is sometimes permissible to kill, even rather than let die, when we come to kill in some ways but not others. In other words, the detective investigating the mysterious trolley problem, maybe it's an expanded notion of that term, but he's investigating this issue, who wants to know if the one person on that sidetrack was killed permissibly, should investigate how that person came to be killed, and also how the 5 came not to be killed, rather than who did the killing, the bystander or the driver. I further said that we could see the trolley problem so understood as presenting a challenge to nonconsequentialists who, in some rough way, think that there is what is called a side constraint on harming a non-threatening person to produce a greater good, such as saving 5 lives. A side constraint is not merely a factor that weighs against producing the greater good. It is supposedly a factor that has priority over producing the greater good. That is, we may produce the greater good only if doing so is consistent with respecting that constraint. Now, an example where we are, many people have thought, constrained from killing 1 to save 5 is the so-called transplant case. I mean, I already gave the Topple case, but this is a well-known case, so I'll mention it, and that's in your diagram 4. If a doctor or someone else kills a single healthy person, she will be able to use his organs to save 5 fatally ill patients for whose illness, let us suppose, this single person nor the doctor is responsible. Yet intuitively, it is impermissible for that doctor to kill the 1 person to save the 5. The challenge is to explain exactly what the side constraint on harming amounts to if it does not exclude turning the trolley and thus killing 1 person to save 5 others. Right? So this is really essentially a repetition of what I discussed the first. So I shall begin the second lecture by considering one view of why many people mistakenly believe this is actually Judith Thomson's view, I forgot to mention that, of why many people mistakenly think the bystander may turn the trolley. Because this explanation of why people mistakenly believe it focuses on the how question. I then want to consider an alternative proposal for both the driver and the mere bystander cases that focuses on different ways in which the trolley can come to be turned or otherwise stop from killing the 5. These different ways amount to both different ways in which the harm to some person comes about, that 1 person, and also different ways in which the good of other persons, the 5, not being harmed, comes about. This proposal claims that if harm to some and the prevention of harm to others come about in certain ways, it will seem, at least, and perhaps actually be permissible to turn the trolley. And then the proposal also attempts to characterize in a more general way what is, when it is and is not permissible to harm some to save others. I will then consider how this proposal relates to the moral distinctions between killing and letting die that we brought up in the first lecture, and also whether the proposal is actually required, given that there are others who I will consider who would also kill rather than let die. And I want to consider what they're permitted to do and whether, this proposal that I want to fly before you has anything to do with that. Okay, so let's just start now. Thomson concludes in her 2008 article, Turning the Trolley, by offering what might be called an error theory for why it has been mistakenly thought that a mere bystander who would otherwise only let 5 people die is permitted to turn the trolley and kill 1 person. She believes people think it is permissible for the bystander to do this because, quote, if he proceeds, he will bring about that more live by merely turning a trolley, end quote. But if she were right about this, shouldn't people also think that it is permissible to turn a trolley? In this other case I call it the 2 trolleys case. It's number 5 on your handout. So suppose one trolley is headed to the 5. We can only redirect this first trolley from the 5, turning it away from them, if we turn a second trolley. So you have 2 trolleys in this diagram. Second trolley is currently running on a track where it would harm no one, 0. But we could turn it, and then it would go into the first trolley and move the trolley away from the 5. However, on its way to redirect that first trolley away from the 5, the second trolley will run into and kill another person as a mere side effect. I mean, it just happens. I doubt that people would think that merely turning a trolley, the second trolley, that's all I'm going to do is I'm going to turn a trolley, makes turning the second trolley permissible. My response to this case is very different from, a bystander turning a trolley away from the 5. If turning the trolley in the standard bystander case still seems morally permissible, when this turning in the second, that second trolley that's going to kill somebody on its way to diverting the first trolley isn't permissible, then I think the explanation of why people think that it's permissible for the bystander to turn the trolley, as many do, will have to point to some other factor than it just involves turning a trolley. So I want to consider some alternative proposals and, to explain why people think. There's first that question, why do they think? And then the issue, of course, is perhaps justifiably so. In other words, they're not wrong to so think. That's the deeper question. Are they right or wrong? That turning the trolley in both the bystander and the driver cases are permissible. One proposal is that if the one person is hit, he would stand in exactly the same relation to the same trolley threat that the five would have if they were hit. So, if you look back at that original two-option case, right? They would all come to be threatened by the same trolley going toward them, either by its going to the five or to the one. This contrasts with what happens in the two-trolley case that I just gave, where the trolley that threatens the five is not the trolley that would threaten the one person. This is also true in the cases that I discussed, another case that I discussed in Lecture 1, which is diagrammed number 2, where the bystander, for example, or the driver could set a bomb that would move the trolley, that one trolley away from the five, but the bomb itself, not the trolley, would kill the one bystander. Okay, that's in diagram 2. So a different, threat. Right? Toppling a fat man from a bridge in front of the trolley so that his body stops it or redirects it also involves something different happening to him from what would have happened to the five. That is to say, he gets plummeted across this bridge, right? And falls in front of the same trolley that would have threatened the five, but the trolley's not being sent to him. No. So some have suggested that perhaps it is the potential victim standing in the same relation to the same threat that distinguishes trolley cases morally from other cases of killing some to save others. Now, somebody might say, well, all right, maybe that explains their views, all right, why does it justify them, all right? But my first problem with this proposal is that I think it's in some ways too narrow, in the sense that I think the trolley cases may be one type in a more general class of cases in which the permissibility of harming is explicable in essentially the same way. So, it may seem dangerous to broaden out from this, one case, the bystander case, right, and say, try to figure out why it's permissible there to lots of others, but I can't help myself because I think that I noticed sort of underlying similarities between this case and others. So we might come to see this underlying general class by considering another aspect of turning the trolley in the very basic case, number 1, right? That it seems like the good of, what I think of as the good, of the greater good of the five being saved, seems like just the flip side, I call it flip side, right, of removing what threatens them, the trolley. You turn the trolley away and they're okay. In this context, in this case, all right? In the circumstances, given that there are no other threats to them already, okay, and, no other threats are coming, the five being saved just is the trolley moving away. Now, I don't mean that necessarily a strict identity, but it just seems like there isn't a further causal relation between turning that trolley away and the five being saved. Some people have suggested, I've been recommended to use this phrase, that it's a constitutive relation. It just constitutes, in this case, the five being saved. By contrast, for example, in the two trolleys case, the second trolley would cause the first trolley to move away from the five, and the first trolley's moving away from the five would have that non-causal flip side, have as its non-causal flip side the five being saved, right? But the means, right, that has this non-causal relation to the five being saved, namely turning the trolley away from them, is not what's going to kill the one person, right? It's rather this trolley, or the second trolley, right, that is going to have this causal relation to the moving of the first trolley, and therefore a mere causal relation to the 5 being saved that is going to be killing that one person. So in this way in which a means comes to harm some and help others, right, in the true trolley case, is different from the way in which the means of saving the 5 in the ordinary trolley case, namely turning the trolley away, and turning the trolley away is what, results in that one other person being dead. It has this different relationship to the 5 being saved. And it at least seems impermissible to me to use means. What this would suggest is that it seems impermissible to use means that have such a mere causal, non-constitutive, or they do not have a flip side relation to the saving of the 5, when those means to the saving of the 5 will also directly harm someone. That second trolley is going to kill that person. Well, that's something I thought, I noticed about the difference between some cases. Whether it's important, I don't know, but it just stuck in my mind. Now, this non-causal relation, let's say now constitutive non-causal relation that moving away of the trolley has to saving the 5 in those standard trolley cases, it seemed to me made the trolley case very close to one in which the 5 being saved, actually being saved itself, leads to the harm to another person. For example, suppose that we cannot redirect the trolley away from them, but we could move them away from the trolley by turning a large swivel table. I call it a lazy Susan. I got it from the Chinese restaurants, somebody told me. So it's represented in diagram 6. So you turn this large swivel table on which the 5 are seated, and the trolley's coming at them. You turn it so that they're away from the trolley. They're okay. However, their being in the safe location puts extra weight on the land. Only in philosophy examples does this occur. And it causes another entity, rocks that are in the area, to fall. And those rocks kill another person, that one person. Now, in this case, the 5 being moved away from the trolley, has this non-causal constitutive relation, I think, to their being safe from the trolley that threatened them. They're away from it. Their being away causes another entity in the environment, rocks, independently of their placing them there, right, to become a threat to someone else. In ordinary trolley cases, by contrast, you cause this entity that's independently in the environment, namely the trolley, to become a threat to someone else by moving it, right? But again, it has this sort of non-causal, as I see it. The flip side is the 5 being saved. So I was just drawing these diagrams that sort of, one case led me to think about the other. Suppose we think that moving the 5 away from the trolley, as in the Lazy Susan case, is permissible. And also, it's, as it seemed to me, for essentially the same reason that turning the trolley from the 5 is thought to be permissible. Then it would not be crucial to the permissibility of turning the trolley that we are redistributing the same threat that already faced some to others, and that those others will stand in the same relationship to the same threat that the original victims would have stood in. Remember, that was one of these first alternative proposals. After all, in the Lazy Susan case, it is the rocks that are caused to move by the 5 being in a safe area, and those rocks threaten the one person, not the trolley that was headed to the 5. So the thing is that I thought that one way to capture what was underlying my sense that it was permissible to turn the Lazy Susan, and it was permissible to turn the trolley away from the 5, and that there was something about these cases that made them mutually justifiable, or would account, forget about justification even, would account for my similar responses to both, was something that I could generalize as a broader view about permissibly and impermissibly seriously harming people, like killing them to save others. And so my shot at it was the following, and a very rough version of it is on your handout, right on the after the Lazy Susan case. I just call it a principle of permissible harm, PPH. So very roughly, it's something like this, that actions are permissible if the greater good, in this case, let's say the 5 people being saved, and I've got a qualification there or a component of it that maybe I'll come back to, but let me just state the simplest version. The greater good, right, or means that have this greater good as its non-causal flip side, right? It's constitutive. You just turn the trolley away without anything further happening, right? The 5 are free of the trolley, and that's their being saved, right? Either that greater good or means having this non-causal relation to the greater good, they're permitted to lead to the lesser harm, even directly. You know, the rocks fall, the trolley bangs into that one person. By contrast, actions actions are impermissible, it seemed, if mere means that are required to produce a greater good, like that second trolley, the ones that have a mere means relation to the greater good of the 5 being saved, or the bomb being set, right, that will turn the trolley okay, you know, it turns the trolley, but it itself doesn't have as a flip side the 5 being saved. That mere means, you know, that bomb is going to kill the one person, that when that's what's going on, all right, these mere means, right, that cause lesser harms, at least directly, are not going to strike us as permissible. It's not going to be permissible to engage in that activity. And finally, actions that cause lesser harm, such as toppling people in front of trolleys, right, when these very harms are needed, they are the means to produce the greater good. It's not that they're side effects caused by means that are needed. They're needed to produce that greater good. They're not going to be justified by the fact that they produce those greater goods. Those actions are still going to strike us as impermissible. So this is what I called, you know, this is a very rough description. I call it a principle of permissible harm. There may be many variants on this sort of general idea, right? I thought that this principle could be described as what I call downstreamish, in that it implies that lesser harms may permissibly be causally downstream, caused by the greater good coming about, or means having the greater good as this flip side, like the movement of the trolley. I say that it's downstreamish rather than downstream for rather complicated reasons, because I think that there are some cases where harms that do come downstream from will also play a role in either sustaining or producing other parts of the greater good. These are lots of complicated cases in the trolley literature that, you know, we don't want to discuss here. And that's why I just want to say that I call it downstreamish instead of downstream. Okay, shouldn't worry us here. Now, it is possible that supervening upon these different ways of bringing about goods and harms, you know, that are distinguished by this principle of permissible harm, it may be that there are supervening on them different relations established between the people harmed and those saved from harm. So in particular, one suggestion is that the permissible ways to harm some to save others, you know, the downstreamish ways, involve some people being substituted for others with regard to being harmed, though not with respect to the same threat, you know. And now, I'm not saying all ways of substituting people are permissible, but the ways that are involved in these cases, right, involves a substitution relation, you know, between people. Some are substituted for others. The impermissible ways that the PPH says, the ways the PPH says are impermissible, seem to involve some people being subordinated to others. This was as far as I could get in getting my sense of what the difference here is in relations between people, either by people being used in certain ways for others, as in toppling them to stop the trolley, or by the harm to them that will occur being considered less important relative to the use of certain means, such as the use of the second trolley or the use of the bomb, when those means will be causally useful for helping a greater number of people. So you're choosing between, allowing yourself to save or use, employ means and the death of this person. Now, harming by substitution possibly could be permissible, even if harming by subordination were impermissible. Now, ultimately, identifying certain relations between people as permissible and impermissible, of course, could reflect on deeper views about our conception of persons and their status, right? And it's not the point of this lecture to investigate these deeper possible meanings of, principle permissible harm such as I have described. But it's important to keep in mind that finding these deeper meanings is both important to a complete understanding and a justification, right, of a solution to the trolley problem, and to showing how the trolley problem is connected more broadly with our conception of persons. Now, I don't doubt that there are many problems with this proposed principle of permissible harm. I've heard about them, and I'm going to continue hearing about them, Nevertheless, for purposes of illustration, only for purposes of illustration, because this is a completely new lecture, hot off the furnace. I cook my stuff on furnaces, not stoves. I don't use stoves. For purposes of illustration, let us consider how a proposal such as the PPH connects with the question of whether a driver who would otherwise kill the five may turn the trolley, but a mere bystander who would only let them die may not. Dealing with this issue may help illustrate one way in which nonconsequentialists could insist on the moral distinction between killing and letting die someone, killing or letting die, without also claiming that the distinction helps draw a line between what the driver may do and what the bystander may do, at least in many cases. So first consider what I call the agent-victim killing, letting die distinction. Some non-consequentialists think that we as agents must make greater efforts to avoid killing someone than to avoid merely letting them die, because of differences in what we would do to the victim. I'm talking about the victim who would be killed and the victim who would be let die. I have argued that this is true. I think it's true. At least when killing someone involves depriving that person of life that he would have continued to have at that time independently of the agent's provision of life. So the agent is not providing life-sustaining, assistance. So, for example, he would go on living if the agent didn't exist, holding everything else constant. When we let die, by contrast, someone loses life he would not continue to have at that time, his life, independently of the agent's provision. You're helping this person go on living. And this person, for example, would die if the agent did not exist, holding everything else constant, like there's nobody else around who's going to save him. Hence, that one agent, all right, must choose between letting five die or killing another person, whereas another agent must choose between killing five or killing another person. Usually says something about what those victims will lose out on because of what the agent does and what those agents' relations are to the people whose lives are at stake. But some of those who focus on this agent-victim killing, letting die distinction, the agent's going to have different relation to the victim in terms of what the victim loses relative to what the agent does, etc. Some of these people who focus on this may be saying not only that there is a moral difference in what an agent does to someone in killing him or letting him die, they may also be saying that what an agent may permissibly do, and so what relation he may have to other people in order to avoid the relation of killing some, is different from what he may do, and so what relation he may have to other people in order to avoid standing in the relation to some of letting them die. Right? So that's the idea that, the bystander is going to let the five die, and those who think that the bystander, may not turn the trolley are saying, well, you can't stand in the relation of killing someone in order to avoid standing in that letting die relation. Okay. However, there is a second type of relation seems to me, which holds between the people whose lives are at stake, rather than between those people and the agents who would affect them. And the question is whether the relation between these people is also sensitive to the distinction between killing and letting die. So I'm going to call this the inter-victim relation. You can call it the inter-victim killing, letting die relation. Where the victims I have in mind are those who were originally threatened, like the 5, and those who would die if we saved those originally threatened, like the one person to whom the trolley would be redirected. What relations hold between these people may well depend on what other agents do to the people, if they're going to turn trolleys on them or not, or away from them or not. But it is possible that at least certain relations between the people whose lives are at stake will be the same, whether those relations are brought about by an agent like the trolley driver who kills some rather than others, or by an agent like the mere bystander who kills some rather than lets others die. For example, suppose the driver of the out-of-control trolley is, as Foote and Thompson see it, in the process of killing the 5. In this case, he is in the process of making them worse off, depriving them of lives they would have had without his provision. If he redirects the trolley, he will be making someone else worse off in the same way, that one person. This is the agent-victim description. Put in inter-victim terms, when I think about just the people whose lives are at stake, it seems to me that the one person will be killed and therefore be made worse off as the alternative to others being killed and being made worse off. This inter-victim description could be true whether it is the driver who turns the trolley or a mere bystander who turns it. Even though as an agent, the mere bystander would let the 5 die and not make them worse off, the 5 would still be killed by the trolley and made worse off. That's what I mean by that, inter-victim relations. A further example may help, I'm skipping here because of time, but a further example may help to reinforce the distinction between the agent's relation to a state of affairs, at least put in terms of killing and letting die, and the inter-victim character of the state of affairs. Suppose I have a choice between either turning a trolley, and here we have a complicated diagram, but I hope my description will lead you through it. Look at diagram 7 and scream now, but I'm going to try to help you with it. Here we have a case where I have a choice, I as a bystander, between option A, turning the trolley away from the 5 onto a track that runs on a bridge so that 2 other people who are on that bridge get toppled off the bridge. Or I could press a switch that moves a fat man off a bridge so that he stops the trolley headed to 5 people. You see A and B there, and that's what those mean. Now, those who emphasize the killing, letting die distinction in the agent-victim relation may see the possible agent-victim relations here as either letting 5 die, or killing 2 people, or killing 1 person. However, from the inter-victim perspective, the relation between those whose lives are at stake will be very different depending on what is done in option A or B, I want to claim. In option A, 2 people will be killed as a consequence of removing a threat to the 5. In option B, 1 person will be killed as a result of, pressing a switch that topples him in order to stop the trolley going to the 5. Now, these different inter-victim relations, so in one case, 2 people are going to die as a result of the 5 being saved. In another case, only 1 person is going to die as a means to saving the 5, okay? These different inter-victim relations are a function of how I think people come to be killed and their role in producing the greater good, whether they have any role in producing the greater good as, means to that greater good. In one case, people are killed as a consequence of the removal of the threat to others, greater number of others. In the second, B, someone is killed as a consequence of a mere means, such as a switch that I pressed, used to move someone so that he is a means to the removal of the threat to others. Now, this difference could make it permissible to actually kill two people in option A, but not permissible to use option B, where we only kill one person. I think it's a mistake to decide whether my killing someone is permissible simply by checking whether it is the alternative to my killing others. We must at least also consider the relations between the people whose lives are at stake that would come about as a consequence of the way in which I do things. In particular, we should consider the relation between the people who are harmed if I act, and in this case, the original 5 who faced the trolley threat. So the rough proposal for that principle of permissible harm that I described earlier, it does, I think, identify relations between potential victims in this way. For example, in some cases, the person killed dies as a result of the greater number being saved, right? As when we turn that, trolley onto the 2, right? Or in the Lazy Susan, when they're being in a safe area causes rocks to kill someone else. Here, the greater good leads to the lesser harm, as I said there. And then the proposal suggests that the inter-victim relation, let's say in option A, is substitution with respect to being threatened, and it's permissible to act. In the 2 trolleys case, the person is killed by a mere means that would causally produce the greater good. And then this relation is said to involve, the proposed subordination is not permissible, or when you topple that one person, it's just one, but the relation is of a different sort. It may be that the driver is permitted to kill fewer people by turning the trolley in the original trolley case, that number 1, only because the inter-victim relation that would be created between potential victims makes it permissible for him to act. It may be that he is not permitted to turn the second trolley in the 2 trolley case because the inter-victim relation that will result makes it impermissible for him to act. Same with toppling. And if the inter-victim relations are the same when the mere bystander turns the trolley, it may be, it seems to me, as permissible or impermissible for him to act. It could be permissible for the bystander to act even if, unlike the driver, he has no duty to act because as an agent he would only be letting 5 die. Now suppose there is something about the inter-victim relation that makes bringing it about morally problematic for the bystander, who would otherwise let 5 die. He can't topple that one person in front of the trolley. When the one person should not be made to stand in that relation to the 5, just so the bystander can avoid the relation to the 5 of letting them die, it's not clear to me why that one person may be made to stand in that relation to the 5 just so that the driver can avoid his relation to the 5 of killing them. Of course, if the relation between potential victims would be different depending on what an agent does, one could say that the agent-victim relation is also different in virtue of this. Namely, in the one case, the agent will make a victim stand in one relation to another potential victim. In another, he'll make the victim stand in a different relation to another potential victim. I don't disagree with that. My response is that this further redescription of the agent-victim relation is dependent in the first instance on considering the potential victims' relations and is emphasized only because it is the inter-victim relations that are significant for permissibility or impermissibility of the redescribed agent-victim relations. Okay, now, suppose the relations between potential victims that I've been trying to describe in this rough way determined whether it is permissible to kill some to save others or not kill them. How would this affect the nonconsequentialist claim that there is a stronger duty not to kill than not to let die? It would not affect one implication of this claim, namely that those who would kill the 5 have an obligation and should pay greater personal cost to not kill them, while those who would only let 5 die may have no obligation not to let them die or to pay great personal costs to save them. Furthermore, it need not affect the claim that there are side constraints Indeed, if bringing about one impermissible inter-victim relation would help us prevent many more such impermissible victim relations, right? We may not be able to do it because there's simply a side constraint on doing that, even to bring about the greater good of fewer such bad or incorrect inter-victim relations. So that side constraints, I don't think, are affected. However, if relations between victims, inter-victim relations, determine permissibility of killing, this would affect the view that there is a duty not to kill that is stronger than either a duty or a desire not to let more people die, in the sense that the duty not to kill would not take precedence in general over the duty or the desire not to let more die. The precedence relation would not hold. You could kill in order not to let die. Now, I think if that were true, this would be one of many instances in which an action is stringent by the measure of there being a duty to do it or having to pay a lot to accomplish it, and yet the action does not take precedence over a duty or preference that is weaker by those same measures of whether it's a duty or how much effort you have to make to have it occur. Here's another such case. I may be morally required to pay a lot of money to keep a contractual promise in business, but not similarly required to pay as much even to save the life of someone drowning. And yet, if I have a choice between doing an optional, even very costly rescue of the drowning person, or else fulfilling my contractual obligation when the two conflict, I think it's permissible for me to do the rescue. So this is a case where precedence of the stronger by the measure of efforts, obligation, all right, doesn't answer the question of whether it can be bumped for the sake of doing something that is merely optional, namely saving the life of the person. And that was just supposed to be analogous, another case where I thought what I had said about killing and letting die, might help illuminate that. Okay, now we're on to a new section. Needless to say, many may not accept the proposal for a principle of permissible harm in relation to the trolley cases that I have described, nor may they accept its relation to the question of killing versus letting die that I try to present. So now I want to pursue a third approach to exploring the permissibility of killing in trolley cases, by contrast to, killing, and killing in trolley cases by contrast to letting die. It begins by considering some other people besides the mere bystander who would also only let die if they did not kill. The aim is to see how much is thought to be permissible for these people, even by those who think redirecting the trolley may be impermissible for a mere bystander, and how the line between what is thought permissible and impermissible for these other people might be drawn. I found it helpful. I had never thought about these cases, but I came across them in this rummage room I have back here, I guess, the back of my head or something. And I thought, well, I got interested in them, so I'm going to discuss them. And I will point out along the way some ways in which these things relate to the proposed principle of permissible harm, but I'm not relying on that principle as fundamental to, driving conclusions. Among those who would only let die if they did not do what kills another are the 5 dying of organ failure in the transplant case, and the 5 to whom the trolley is headed in the trolley case. If the 5 were able to, but did not kill someone else, and thereby save themselves, they could, but they don't, they would be letting themselves die. Let us begin with the 5 in transplant. Even though their own lives are at stake, and here, think about yourself. We were told by Chris Coots at the beginning of the last lecture, as far as you can, involve yourself with these cases. So, even though our own lives are at stake, I believe it would be impermissible for us to kill one person for the organs we need in the way imagined to be necessary in this case. I believe it would be also impermissible, actually, for us to release a gas that we need to cure ourselves if we know this gas will, as a side effect, suffocate someone else nearby. However, suppose that the five, and here I'll go back to the impersonal voice, but suppose that the five could successfully treat their medical problem by means that harm absolutely no one. They concoct this little cure. Once cured, they will begin to breathe normally. And their expanding chests will move some fatal germs in the atmosphere that would otherwise have been safely at rest. The germs will reach one other person and kill him, as in diagram 8. Is it permissible for the five to cure themselves when they know all this will happen? Must they let themselves die instead? I think it is permissible for them to bring about their normal state by these innocent means, even though their normal breathing will then turn an entity in the environment, namely the germs, into a fatal threat to others. I emphasize that this permissibility is not merely a matter of their being excused in acting wrongfully because they're in such extreme circumstances. Rather, they do not act wrongfully, I think. Notice that in this case, though they create a threat to others, right, it's not a threat that did confront them. They weren't, going to die as a result of these germs, right? They create this new threat, the germs were safely away and now they're breathing and things are moving and blah, blah, blah. I still think their action is permissible. According to the principle of permissible harm, what explains the permissibility, or our sense that it is permissible, is roughly that the five being alive and breathing normally is the greater good, and then one person, than one person being alive, five alive is better than one, and greater good may permissibly lead to what causes the lesser harm of one dead. The lesser harm is then causally downstream from the greater good. Now, suppose that what interferes with organs of the five and their normal breathing is a heavy weight that is on them, as in diagram 9. If by some great effort they could breathe normally just once, their chest expansion would push away this heavy weight, which would roll on to kill one other person. Once rid of the weight, the five's organs and breathing would recover, permanently. In this case, we have an entity present in the environment, independently of the actions of the five, that will either kill them or go on to kill someone else. Here it's not germs that wouldn't have threatened them, it's the same threat. I think it would be permissible for the five to breathe normally initially, thus removing the threat for themselves, though it kills another. Now I'm going to skip to where? If the five may move the weight by breathing normally, the question that remains is whether they may simply move the weight in order to breathe normally and not die. Can they just take it in their hands and move it? Right? Even though the weight will then go on and kill another person. As the principle of permissible harm would have it, the question here is whether they are permitted to remove a threat in the environment whose removal has this non-causal flip side, whatever you want to call it, constitutive relation to the greater good of their functioning normally, though the removal causes the weight of the harm to someone else. Now, in the trolley cases, the same issues just described in variants of transplant arise for the five who would not, or if they do not let themselves die, okay? Though their doing this will result in the death of one other person. Hence, some of these diagrams with, weights and germs in it, just think of trolleys instead. They can do double duty. Even though their lives are at stake, the five toward whom the trolley is headed are not, I believe, permitted to use a device to topple a fat man in front of the trolley to stop it going to them. Nor may they use a bomb that will stop the trolley but kill someone else. I don't think we can do that. However, suppose the trolley is coming down a track toward one person. It's a slightly different case. Case number, let's see, where is the case? I'll find it in a minute. It's diagram 12, apparently. Yeah, we skipped to 12. Sorry for that. Suppose that the 5 are on this track, right? And the trolley's coming down a track. The 5 are between the trolley and one person behind them. And their being hit, of course, will stop the trolley and the one will be saved. It is permissible for them to run away or duck, even if this one person is then killed instead, since they are thus terminating protection for him that they are not required to provide him, I think. So that's in 12. What if in another case the 5 are alone on the track? There's no one behind them, trolley's coming at them. If they move away, they will wind up in a safe area away from the trolley. But their being in this safe area causes some rocks to fall, as in diagram 13. And those rocks will kill another person. I believe it would still be permissible for them to escape the trolley in this case, too. And if they're breathing normally, somehow they got this really strong breath, right? Cause the trolley to move away from them, right, toward another, I think they can breathe. These cases fall into the class of the good of the 5 being alive, causing an entity, either the trolley that threatened them originally or some rocks becoming a threat, a fatal threat to another person. If the trolley is headed only to the 5, they may also, I think, shield themselves from it, as represented in diagram 10. Even if they know, when they set up the shield, that the trolley's interacting with the shield will cause the trolley to be deflected towards another person. Here it is not the greater good itself of their being alive and functioning, blah, 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 that leads to the lesser harm, but a device that maintains the good. But unlike the bomb, this is a device that maintains the good without causing harm to others, independently of the trolley interacting with it. The question remains is whether those who can do all these things in these trolley cases, rather than let themselves die, even when what they do kills another person, may simply move the trolley away from themselves so that they are safe, rather than moving it or some other threat like rocks as a consequence of their being safe, of their breathing normally, or of using a shield that protects them. This is like the question we asked earlier, whether the 5 on whose organs a weight is pressed may just remove the weight, though they know it will roll on to someone else. What could morally distinguish what is agreed, let's suppose it's agreed, what it is supposed it is agreed the 5 may permissibly do? What could distinguish those things from turning the trolley or moving the weight? Here's a proposal. If they push the threat away or press a switch that does that, the 5 would get rid of the threat by actively and deliberately doing something to it, just as they do when they set a bomb that kills someone. My concern is that this proposal, this objection to their moving it, in effect just draws no distinction between actively and deliberately doing something to an entity when, I hate to use it again, when doing this just constitutes or has as its flip side the 5 being free of the threat it presents. And by contrast, when moving or doing something directly to an entity doesn't have that relationship as when you set the bomb going. So the alternative view that I'm suggesting here is that the 5 removing a threat to themselves is in itself as permissible as their breathing normally or moving to safety, because the trolley constitutes, the trolley, being away from them just has as that flip side their being safe. If they're breathing normally and being in a safe area are still permissible, though they cause an entity in the environment to harm someone else, then moving away the trolley threat, it's being suggested, should be permissible, even when this causes it, an entity in the environment, to harm someone else. That's the claim of this. Now, before we consider what implications, if any, these cases might have where threatened people need not let themselves die, Do they have any implications for mere bystander cases or driver cases? Let's consider some other potential victims who face a choice between letting themselves die or killing others. Okay, well, okay, we'll try. Suppose one person has multiple organ failure and it's causing his death. He's not simply permitted to kill 5 people to get their organs or use a gas to save himself that will kill 5, I think. But suppose the one person was able to cure his organ failure by innocent means so that he would breathe and his chest expanded properly and it moved those germs. I think this one person could cure himself innocently and breathe and those germs would move and they would kill 5. Now, this conclusion is consistent with a nonconsequentialist view that sometimes it's permissible to do acts that don't produce the best consequences. It all depends on the nature of the acts and how those bad consequences are brought about. Now, the same thing could happen, if a trolley is headed only to one person. Sorry, the trolley is headed only to one person, all right? And some of the same questions arise. May he move to safe ground when his being there will cause rocks to fall on and kill 5 people? May he breathe if, the breathing moved the trolley, right? I think those are permissible even for the one person, and I found this as a big shock. I mean, I'd never considered these cases, even though it's going to kill 5, right? So surprisingly, it seems then that one person may permissibly do a lot that the 5 are permitted to do. And so this can't be because his actions conform to the principle of permissible harm that I described. Right? So it seems like the principle of permissible harm really has 2 parts to it. It has the part that distinguishes different ways of bringing about harm to innocence, and secondly, it applies these distinctions in cases where greater good is being produced and lesser evil is also at stake. But it's possible that, the distinctions function on their own, even if it's lesser good that's being produced and greater evil that results. Okay, so I want to say that I found that rather interesting, and I'm interested to know what people think about it. But now, again, are there implications from what these 5 or the 1 are permitted to do for themselves for what a bystander could be permitted to do? Now, because in thinking about what it was permissible for that 1 or 5 to do on their own behalf, I didn't rely on any view that implies that people who are themselves threatened may just do anything they need to save themselves. I denied that. It's possible that our conclusion about the 1 and the 5 may do could generalize to the bystander who would kill rather than let die. Okay? Now, it might come as a shock if you think, well, suppose one person can do the things that I said the 5 could do on their own behalf. Does this mean that I think that a bystander, could permissibly turn not only from 5 to 1, but from 1 to 5? Okay? That would truly be a shocking conclusion. I actually don't think it's so shocking if you think of the mere bystander as a friend or a bodyguard to the one person, helping them do what it's permissible for them to do. But I do think that an impartial bystander, someone who's not committed to one person over another, right, should act for the sake of producing the greater good, namely that the 5 survive, but that this person should do it in permissible ways. So, for example, and I'll just mention these in passing without giving my explanations, if there's one person on a track, trolley is headed towards him, and behind him are 5 people, so that he's blocking the trolley from hitting the 5, right? Suppose he couldn't duck or move away, as I said I thought a nonconsequentialist should concede he can. Should an impartial bystander help remove him? Or should you just let him stay there? Suppose it's very easy for him to move that one person. I think it would be wrong for the bystander not to help that person off the track, even though that means the 5 will be killed. Now, I don't have the time to explain that. So I don't think impartial bystanders always favor 5. They may not improperly create improper relations between the 1 and the 5 or treat the 1 improperly in the course of favoring the 5. But it seems to me that impartial bystanders may do a great deal more of what the 5 are permitted to do to help themselves than what the 1 is permitted to do to help himself. I think that the impartial bystander may remove the 5 to safety, though this results in the 1, being hit by rocks. I think he can shield them, though this means the trolley bumps off onto the one. And finally, the question remains, as it did in our earlier discussion, if that impartial bystander can do all those things to help the five when this results in causing the death of one, why not turn the trolley? Thank you.
I want to start by reading something that appeared in the Globe and Mail a few years ago. The newspaper had run a book review that talked about the trolley problem, and it generated the following letter to the editor. The ethical dilemmas involving a runaway trolley illustrate the uninformed situations that cause people's eyes to glaze over in philosophy class. Trolleys and trains cannot run away because they're equipped with a dead man's pedal that applies the brakes the moment the driver is incapacitated. The potential rescuer would not have the option of throwing the switch because track switches are locked to prevent vandalism. And the rescuer's response would depend on the speed of the trolley. If the speed were less than 15 kilometers an hour, the rescuer could jump onto the trolley, sound the bell, and save all 5 lives. If the speed were less than 30 kilometers an hour, then the rescuer, with a switch lock key, could throw the switch and kill only the one person on the branch line. But if the trolley were moving faster than 30 kilometers an hour, throwing the switch would cause it to derail, which would injure or kill the passengers but save the workers on the tracks. So the better choice is to allow the occupied trolley to run through on the main track and regrettably kill the 5 workers. Signed, Derek Wilson, former CN Rail Transportation Engineer and Project Manager, Port Moody, British Columbia. At the risk of annoying any retired rail engineers in the audience, and taking advantage of the generous invitation from the Tanner Committee and the stimulation of Francis's wonderful lectures, I'm going to say something uninformed about trolleys. Frances Kamm's brilliance as a moral philosopher has 2 sides. She's an incisive critic of other moral views, pointing out implications their proponents didn't realize they have and challenging them with arresting counterexamples. She's also a creative philosopher who's proposed many novel moral principles and ideas. Her critical side was to the fore in her first Tanner lecture, and her constructive side in her second. I'm going to focus on a positive claim about the trolley problem from her second lecture. This will involve my trying to play the role of critic. The trolley problem asks why it's impermissible to save 5 people by throwing a fat man in front of a trolley, but permissible to save them by diverting the trolley to another track where it will likewise kill 1 person. This is a problem because the natural explanation why it's wrong to throw the fat man, that then you actively do something that causes his death rather than merely allow him to die, implies that it would also be wrong to divert the trolley, which isn't what most of us intuitively believe. And while the doctrine of double effect seems to match our beliefs in these cases, Frances thinks it has counterintuitive implications in other cases and should therefore be rejected. Hence her proposal, both in earlier writings and in today's lecture, of her principle of permissible harm that she says yields the right results and was on the bottom of page 2 of the handout. Like the view that distinguishes doing from allowing, Francis's principle looks at the causal process that produces the death of the one rather than at any facts about your mental state. But unlike that view, it doesn't consider how you relate to its death. Instead, it focuses on a causal distinction that arises later in the causal process after you've done what you do. What is this distinction? Both when you throw the fat man and when you divert the trolley, your act will produce an evil, namely 1 person's death, but it'll also produce a greater good, which Frances describes as, quote, the 5 being saved. Now, I think that's an ambiguous description, and I think tomorrow I'll return to that issue, but for now I'll accept the description. What a principle of permissible harm says is that it matters how the lesser evil is caused. If this evil results from a causal means to the greater good, then the act producing the greater good is impermissible. That's why throwing the fat man is wrong. He'll be killed by his body's colliding with the trolley, which is a causal means to stopping the trolley and thereby saving the 5. But an act that produces the same evil may not be impermissible if the evil results from the greater good itself or for something that's not a causal means to it, but instead has the greater good as what Frances calls its non-causal flip side, so the 2 are in effect the same thing. That's why, according to her, diverting the trolley isn't wrong. Here what saves the 5 is the trolley's moving away down the other track. And that's not a causal means to their being saved, but the same thing under a different description. As she puts it, the 5 being saved just is the trolley moving away. So in both the fat man and diversion cases, you actively do something, and your act leads by a series of intermediate steps to a good and also to an evil, namely the death of the one. In the first case, the evil results from one of the intermediate steps, which is why throwing the fat man is wrong. But in the second case, it results from the good itself, or from something effectively equivalent to it, rather than from an intermediate step, which makes the diverting the trolley permissible. Well, so applied, the principle of permissible harm seems to yield the right result in the trolley cases. But it has what I think are counterintuitive implications in another case, and is therefore open to the same kind of objection Francis makes to the doctrine of double effect. This case occurred to me while I was thinking about the ethics of war, and so it's got a military setting. So there's a munitions factory that's a legitimate military target and that we want to bomb, but that has civilians living near it who will be killed by our attack. Most moral views say that if the number of civilians who will be killed is not disproportionate to the factory's military importance, the bombing is permitted. But Francis's principle says that whether that's so depends on how the civilians will be killed. If they'll be killed by a flying piece of the bombing is morally impermissible. That's because the good our act can achieve is the destruction of the factory. The bombs exploding is a causal means to that, and causing even a lesser evil by a means to a greater good is forbidden. But if the civilians will be killed by a flying piece of factory, the bombing is permitted. The factory's exploding isn't a causal means to the destruction of the factory. It's effectively the same thing, or has the destruction of the factory as its non-causal flip side. So the principle that allows the diverting of the trolley also allows bombings in which civilians are killed by flying pieces of factory, but doesn't allow bombings in which the same civilians are killed by flying pieces of bomb. Well, I find that implication pretty hard to accept. Whatever the morality of collateral harm in war ultimately says, I don't think anything in it can turn on whether civilians are killed by one kind of flying object rather than another. Nor do I think the world's militaries have a strong moral duty to develop weapons that will kill civilians only indirectly by what they make explode, rather than by their own explosive force. Well, I presented this case to Frances at a workshop on the ethics of war some years ago. In reply, she gave me her most winning smile and said, "They all laughed at Christopher Columbus."
I think I said Galileo. I never knew about Christopher.
No, you...
It doesn't matter, forget it.
See, Frances doesn't know that that's the opening line of a George and Ira Gershwin song. She was they all laughed at Christopher Columbus or Galileo. She was acknowledging that her principle has the implication I pointed out and saying that however surprising the implication may be, we should accept it. And she's continued to accept it. In her Ethics for Enemies book, she says, and I quote, "It might be permissible to drop bombs on a military factory if the side effect deaths of civilians were caused by the destruction of the factory itself, but not if they were caused by the bombs." That's what her principle of permissible harm implies, and she seems to endorse it. But that's a strange thing for her, of all people, to do. Her primary method in moral theory has been what she calls the method of cases. It establishes moral principles by appealing to our intuitive judgments, but the primary intuitions concern particular examples. We don't first decide that certain principles are correct and then settle cases by applying the principles to them. We first consult our intuitions about cases and accept principles only if they're consistent with those intuitions. So she'll sometimes reject an attractive-sounding principle because it conflicts with just one or a few particular judgments. So in one of her earlier problems on trolleys, Judy Thompson proposed that it's less morally objectionable to redirect an existing threat, as you do when you divert the trolley, than to create a new threat, as when you throw the fat man. Frances has rejected this proposal because it yields what she thinks is the wrong result in the Lazy Susan case she described in her lecture today, where rotating a Lazy Susan with 5 people on it to remove them from the path of a trolley causes a rock slide that kills another person. Now, on a scale of ingenuity and philosophical examples, I think the Lazy Susan case comes pretty high. I certainly couldn't have thought it up myself. But precisely for that reason, I find it less than completely decisive, even if, once I've figured out how it works, I share Frances's intuition that rotating the Lazy Susan is permitted. I'm not very confident about that intuition, just because the example is so far from reality. But my factory bombing case comes way lower on the scale. In recent years, there have been thousands of bombings of military targets in which thousands of civilians have been killed, some directly by the bomb and some indirectly by its effects, for example, by the collapse of the targeted building. Yet no one has thought that in these real-life cases, Frances's distinction makes a moral difference. Now, in Ethics for Enemies, she notes that her distinction isn't recognized in standard just war theory, but I don't think that's only because the theory's framers didn't think about the distinction. I'm pretty sure that if they had thought of it, they wouldn't have given it weight, and would have been very confident in not giving it weight. However much force the Lazy Susan case has against Thompson's earlier proposal about redirecting threats, I think the factory bombing case has more force against the principle of permissible harm. Now, it may be relevant that the case occurs in war, and that suggests a possible response for Frances. In Ethics for Enemies, she suggests that war may be a special context that alters the morality of harming in certain ways. So maybe a principle that yields the right results in trolley cases isn't properly applicable in war, in which case a counterexample set in war doesn't tell against its use elsewhere. Now, I don't myself believe that war is a special context. I think the morality of war is just an extension of the everyday morality of self and other defense. And even if war is a special context, we need a specific argument why one of its effects is to make a principle of permissible harm that's otherwise applicable no longer so. Finally, war can presumably be a special context only for those involved in it, as soldiers or at least as citizens of a warring nation. But imagine that our enemy has located its munitions factory on its border with a neutral country, so the civilians who'll be killed are neutrals. Our duties to them surely haven't changed, yet I still think it makes no difference whether they're killed by a piece of bomb or a piece of factory. Moreover, parallel cases can be constructed outside of war and even involving a trolley. Imagine that an out-of-control trolley is hurtling toward me and 4 other people, and if we do nothing, will kill us. We can't divert the trolley, but have a bomb we can throw to stop it. There's no one on the trolley, but there's a bystander next to the track who'll be killed if we throw the bomb. May we do so? Well, people may disagree about this case. I think Judy Thompson will say we may not throw the bomb. We're not permitted to kill the bystander, but must instead let the trolley kill us. My own view is that we may throw the bomb, and not just because there are 5 of us. Even if I were alone on the track, I'd be permitted to throw the bomb, because in circumstances like these, each person is permitted to care somewhat more about his own good. So I think we may act. But Frances's principle implies, I believe, that whether or not we may throw the bomb depends on how the bystander will be killed. If she'll be killed by a piece of bomb, we're not permitted to save our lives, because then her death will result from a causal means to the stopping of the trolley. But if she'll be killed by a piece of trolley, we are permitted, because the trolley's exploding just is its stopping, or has its stopping as its non-causal flip side. And I think Frances implicitly acknowledged this in yesterday's lecture. The case I've just described is close to her bomb trolley case, which is actually the second diagram on today's handout. And about that case, she said, and I'm quoting, "It seems to me impermissible to set off a bomb that will stop the trolley from hitting the 5 when a piece of the bomb will kill a bystander as a side effect. Why the reference here to a piece of the bomb, killing the bystander? Why not just say you may not set off the bomb?" I think Frances was recognizing that given her principle, using a bomb to stop the trolley isn't wrong if the bystander will be killed by a flying piece of trolley. So her bomb trolley case looks pretty analogous to my factory case, and my intuition about it is exactly the same. Just as it makes no difference in the wartime case whether the civilians will be killed by a piece of bomb or a piece of factory, so it makes no difference in the trolley case whether the bystander will be killed by a piece of bomb or a piece of trolley. And if that's true, then it's not true that Frances's principle has counterintuitive implications only in wartime, when it might be argued that it doesn't apply. It also has them in cases involving trolleys. Well, so far, I'm just going to say a little bit more. I've sort of followed Frances's method of cases and criticized her principle of permissible harm for failing to match some particular intuitions. But I don't think that's the only method we should use in moral theory. Like Shelly Kagan, and I guess like Judy yesterday, I think our moral principles should not only match our particular judgments, but also be intuitively appealing in themselves. In fact, they have to be appealing in themselves if they're to explain the particular judgments. And here I see a further difficulty for Frances's principle as she applies it. The downstream causal distinction it draws doesn't seem in itself morally significant. Let me just say something briefly about this. So, to yield the right results in cases like the trolley case, Frances has to label as and treat as a greater good something that doesn't matter morally in itself, for example, by being good in itself, but is only good as a means to something else that matters in itself. Now, that's clearest in the factory bombing case. There's nothing good in itself in the factories being destroyed. That's something that's only worth doing because it'll contribute to what other good we're trying to achieve through the war, like the ending of an aggression or the prevention of a genocide. And if the destruction of the factory didn't contribute to that further goal, it would be wrong to destroy the factory if doing so would kill some civilians. So destroying the factory is itself only a means to what really matters, which is the war's ultimate purpose. In fact, it's one of a series of means leading to that ultimate purpose. There might be 100 such means. There's the taking off of the plane, the pilots pushing the button that releases the bomb's exploding, the factory's being destroyed, and then what other steps we can take after the factory's been destroyed that help us achieve the ultimate goal. Now imagine that the factory's exploding is number 38 on this list of means, and the bomb's exploding is number 37. What Francis's principle says is, it's wrong if the death of the one is caused by means number 38. It's all right if the death of the civilian is caused, in this case more than one civilian, the death of civilians is caused by means number 38, but not all right if it's caused by means number 37 or earlier. Well, why distinguish in that way between means? They're all just means. And why make the cut between 37 and 38? Why not say it's all right if it's caused by the explosion of the bomb, but not if it's caused directly by the pilots pressing the button? So it looks to me as if the principle, as applied in this case, just draws an arbitrary distinction in a sequence of means, treating one of them as a greater good when it is no more or less a good than any other sequence of the means. Now that's the factory case. I think the same is true of the trolley case once you disambiguate the expression, the 5 being saved, which is Francis's label for the greater good. But I don't have time to do that today. I think we have a seminar tomorrow, and I hope I will talk about that tomorrow. But just to kind of summarize, Francis got this, I'll do something, I'm just gonna say, Francis said she feels like Saint Sebastian with all the arrows flying at her. So I'm going to elaborate that criticism tomorrow, but I also want to point to some cases where I think something like Francis's causal distinction actually is persuasive. It's not in trolley-like cases. It's other cases that occurred to me in war where I think something like Francis's distinction between an effect of something good and an effect of a means to something good does seem to have moral significance. But I'll leave that for tomorrow. Thanks very much.
Well, let me just start by saying what an honor it is to be here in this company. I have read, admired, and learned from Francis's work, Tom's work, Judy's work for decades. And if I were to begin to try to tell you how much I admire it, that would completely use up all the time I've been allotted. So having just said that, let me turn to the part in which I say nasty things about Francis. Now, actually, to begin with, anybody who's immersed himself in the trolley car literature might reasonably despair of ever finding a principle that matches our intuitions about the dozens, if not hundreds, of cases, many hundreds of which have been individually contributed by Francis. But it seems to me plausible to suppose that there is some principle that could be stated. Let's just call it for the moment principle Q, and suppose that Q accurately states or predicts, our intuitions about in which of these cases it's permissible to turn the trolley, throw the lazy Susan, throw the bomb, or what have you. I find it plausible to think there is some principle Q out there because, after all, something's generating our intuitions. And so, in principle, at least, there could be some statement that accurately predicted that. Now, in saying that, I'm supposing that I'm actually bracketing the worry that we don't all have the same intuitions about all of the cases. And that's a worry that, if time permits, I'll come back to later. And if it doesn't permit it today, I'll want to talk about tomorrow. But for the time being, as I say, just bracket that problem and suppose that all of our intuitions are on the same page, case by case by case. So there's going to be some law, however complicated, that predicts accurately when we think it's permissible to take the action in question, when we don't, and just call that Q. Now, suppose we had Q. Would we be done? Would we have solved the trolley problem? Sadly, not. because it could easily turn out to be the case, for all we've seen so far, until we've got the details of Q, that the concepts and distinctions and so forth that principle Q turns on are ones that, once they're brought to light and we stare them in the face, we are not prepared to endorse as morally being relevant. Now, without suggesting that the examples I'm going to give are at all plausible candidates for what would show up in Q, let me just give you some illustrations just so you can see easily, yeah, if this is what Q was talking about, we'd never think that this was a correct, a valid, a sound moral principle. Suppose that in order to state Q, we had to start talking about whether the victims were wearing plaid or stripes, or whether or not they were tall or short, or whether it was raining or sunny, or whether they were drinking coffee or Coca-Cola. Now, if anything like that was the case, but still, imagine that shocking as this may be, it turns out when you take those things into account, Q 100% accurately matches your intuitions, all of our intuitions. I take it what we would end up saying is, whoa, not look at this interesting thing we've learned about what matters morally, but rather, whoa, look at this interesting thing we've learned about how screwed up our psychology is in generating intuitions about things. What we need to have in Q, whatever it should turn out to be, are distinctions, concepts, and so forth that we can step back from and say, oh yeah, I see why something like that should matter. We need a rationale, as we might put it, a kind of story about why ethics cares about things like this. Now, that's not to say that Q couldn't end up turning on concepts that have that feature. I suppose if the correct statement of Q had turned out to be something as simple as the prohibition against doing harm, as opposed to merely allowing it, there's a story that we can tell about why doing harm might have some special moral weight. Not all of us might find that story convincing, but at least we'd see, all right, I can see how you can begin to provide a rationale there. Or to take a somewhat more complicated example, suppose that Q had ended up talking about harming as a means versus as a mere side effect. It's a bit more complicated to spell that out, but again, we could begin to see how a rationale might be provided. But still, we're going to want some such rationale. Otherwise, we're going to say, you know what? Merely having stated Q is merely doing a bit of psychology, not yet doing moral philosophy, or not enough to be finished in terms of solving the trolley problem. Now, the worry is that the more complicated and messy Q turns out to be, this is just kind of priors here, the greater the danger that it will bring into play stuff like this that you just wonder, how could anything like that really matter? Or the more unfamiliar and abstruse the concepts are, the greater the dangers. No guarantee, but the greater the danger. And what I want to suggest is that's what happens when we turn to Frances's proposal, her favorite proposal, the principle of permissible harm, which she has sketched for us today. She only sketched it, as she remarks in earlier work. She spelled it out in somewhat greater detail. I didn't actually bring the quote with me. There's a passage in Intricate Ethics where she gives a kind of provisional, somewhat less rough statement of the principle. As I recall, it takes 3/4 of a page of fine print in the footnotes. And there, too, she says, yeah, this isn't the whole thing, but this is, But the complexity isn't what I want to complain about today. What I really want to draw attention to is the key concept. Now, of course, Frances explained it, then Tom explained it. I'm going to try explaining it a third time. Here's the basic idea, and this is rough, but I think it's the basic idea. So in some cases, there's the event, the saving of the five. And in certain cases, that very event causes the harm to the one, let's say, the lesser harm. It may not be that when we think about it, we are thinking of it as the saving of the five. It might be that very same event under a different description. I think this is more or less what Frances is getting at when she talks about the non-causal flip side. It's the same thing from another angle. Hence, the flip side, the two sides of the coin. There's some murky metaphysics in there because sometimes Frances talks as though it's the very same event under a different description. Other times she talks as though they're distinct events, but they're intimately related in a non-causal way. Those of you familiar with the contemporary debates in metaphysics about the nature of events and their relations will see there's a couple of different ways we could try to spell this out. Francis never really explores that metaphysics. It's not going to be important for what I want to talk about. So just help ourselves to the simplifying understanding that it's the very same event under different descriptions. All right, so sometimes, Francis says, the very same event that is the saving causes the evil, the death of the one. And in other cases, that's not what's going on. In other cases, there's a distinct event which will in turn lead to the saving, but it's this distinct event which causes the evil. All right. Francis' thought is that that's the key distinction. Roughly speaking, a lot of details and qualifications aside, roughly speaking, the thought is that when you've got the saving itself being the means to the evil, that's okay. When you've got the mere means to the saving causing the evil, that's not okay. Also, I want to now ask, so that's her proposal for Q, right? And I say, all right, so that's interesting. Let's just suppose that matches our intuitions perfectly. Actually, I've been reading Francis' work, as I say, for many, many years, and to a surprising extent, it does match my intuitions. And so let's suppose she's gotten it exactly right. That's no mean feat, but as I was trying to suggest earlier, that's not enough. So we ask ourselves, what kind of rationale is there for caring about this feature, this difference, this distinction? And happily, Francis does say something about it. This difference, she suggests, maps onto the difference between what she calls mere substitution on the one hand and subordination on the other. And so, again, she doesn't say much about this, but intuitively, I hope I'm being fair in glossing it this way. Sometimes the interests of one person are subordinated. They're treated in such a way as to basically constitute their being considered less valuable than somebody else. They're subordinated to somebody else. Slavery is the obvious paradigmatic example of that. It's clearly morally abhorrent. In other cases, Francis says, okay, in other cases, yes, somebody ends up dying, but this kind of subordination didn't take place. They were simply switched. There was mere substitution rather than subordination. And intuitively, it's plausible you can feel this, that, all right, yes, subordination seems objectionable in a way that mere substitution would not be. And then Francis says, okay, so now here's my rationale, which she's only going to gesture towards in today's talk. She's not going to explore, but here's the rationale, that when you've got the saving itself causing the evil, that's mere substitution. But when you've got the means to the saving causing the evil, that's subordination. And all I want to say is, really? Huh? I just don't see it. I mean, I literally don't see it at all. So let me try to just walk us through a case, right? So actually a pair of cases, because we're supposed to have the contrast. So in the original trolley car, standard trolley car problem, it occurs to me I have no idea when I started. How much time have I got left?
You could go for another 5 to 10
Okay,
minutes.
good, great, thanks. I shouldn't need it. I say now, and then when I do, remind me that I've used it up. Okay, so in the original trolley car case, when we turn the trolley, the saving itself is the turning of the trolley, because once the trolley is turned, then the five are saved, and that the turning so the saving itself is the turning. That's its non-causal flip side, and that's what causes the death of the one. That's a permissible case, says our intuition that Francis is trying to explain. In contrast, there's a case that she introduced early in today's lecture, the two-trolley case. It's as it happens, it's number 5 on your handout. Let me remind you how the case is structured. There's a trolley. The first trolley that is on its way to killing 5. But if you send a second trolley, which is off, it's minding its own business, as it were. If you send a second trolley to bump the first trolley, it will bump it out of the way, and so that it will no longer kill the 5. Sadly, en route to doing the bumping, it will run over somebody, and so it will kill the one. That's the double trolley case. And Francis's intuition is that that's not permissible, and her cue, the principle of permissible harm, yields that, because in this case, in the two trolley case, the evil is caused by the sending of the second trolley to bump the first. The saving is the bumping of the first trolley. The sending of the second trolley is a mere means to that, and so it's a mere means to the saving that causes the evil, and so that's impermissible according to the principle. So we ask, okay, so look, why is the one kind of case legitimate versus the other? And Francis's answer is, well, yeah, of course, her principle yields this, but we're asking why believe that? And Francis's answer is, in the trolley case, what we've got is mere substitution, whereas in the double trolley case, what we've got is subordination. That's what Francis says, and all I can say is, I can't see for the life of me why I should believe that. I mean, we can't just of course, we can just slap these labels on, subordination versus substitution. If she just did it by stipulation, that would be great. But then we'd be being misled when we thought that corresponded to any independently attractive moral categories. Instead, I take it that we've got independent fix on the thought. Subordination bad, in principle, mere substitution, that might be okay. And what I want to know is, why should I think that the difference between the single trolley case and the double trolley case is introducing subordination? Why is it not subordination when the victim, the one, is killed by the saving itself? That's not subordination. But why does it become subordination? Something we have an independent fix on being illegitimate. Why does it become subordination when the victim is killed by the mere means to the saving? I just literally don't see it. And there was nothing, of course, in today's lecture to defend that. Now, there's a sense in which this complaint is unfair. Right? Because Francis said she's not going to say much about this. Yes, this is an important issue to pursue the deeper meanings. And so I'm piling on about something that she confessed more needed to be said about. And so maybe that's just an illegitimate criticism. But here's why I think it's not. Because it would be one thing to have gotten us to the situation where we can see why her technical distinction maps onto a morally significant distinction. And then for her to say, all right, we need to say more about this moral distinction, but that's a job for a later discussion. But I think she hasn't gotten us to that point. She's given us two distinctions: the technical distinction and this moral distinction between substitutions and mere substitution and subordination. And she's claimed the two distinctions map onto each other in the relevant way, but hasn't offered us, as far as I can see, anything at all to support that claim. So it's not good enough to do that, I think. Now, at least that's what she didn't do today. I didn't do my homework. Unlike Tom, I didn't go back and reread the discussion in Intricate Ethics, and I see that she's got 5 of her books here, so maybe, in response, Francis will say, but, on page 456, so that's possible, because I need to hear more. But in the absence of hearing more, I'm inclined to think this is like the case where Q ends up turning on the weather, or the color of the shirt, or what have you. It just doesn't matter. And the moral of the story, if that's right, is not, and so look, we've solved the trolley problem, but rather, look, our intuitions about the trolley problem are not acceptable. We shouldn't embrace them. We need to modify our view. We need to move to a more reformist position in which we do not look for a principle that matches our intuitions about the full range of trolley cases. Now and here's going to be just the last remark. There's a more modest way to do that. The more modest position might be to move to something like Judy's current position, where she says, the relevant line is basically killing versus letting die. And that no longer matches all our intuitions, doesn't even match our intuition about the original trolley case that got the whole thing started. But still, we might decide to say with Judy, you know what? Let that intuition go. The correct solution to the trolley problem case is this simpler principle, which after all has a rationale, and that outweighs its failure to match our intuitions as fully. That's that's the modest reformist view. But it might be that instead that we should be more radically reformist and say, you know what, we ought to move to a principle that gives up even more of our intuitions because of an even more compelling rationale. To wit, perhaps we ought to move to the consequentialist view that says what we ought to do is simply do the action that makes the world as good as it possibly could be. That's, in fact, what I think the correct solution to the trolley problem is. But to argue for that would be a discussion for another day. Thanks.
Thanks, Shelley. So I think at this point it would make sense to give Francis at least the opportunity to give an initial response to the comments. And I should say that my image of Francis is not as Saint Sebastian, but instead of the Kung Fu master in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, who with a swish of her robe deflects wave after wave of arrows. So she can start deflecting now.
I'm very grateful for all these great comments, and I'm not sure how, I'm not sure what to say, except that I agree. I mean, all this is here really to pay back some debts. I'm going to throw them at somebody. But no, the thing is that I do agree, and, I was just going to point out that I say that, principles have to seem in some sense plausible in themselves. They have to express some not just connect the dots of our intuitions, but some plausible value or conception of the person or relations between persons. So I agree with that. The thing is that I just wanted to point out both Tom and Shelley described the view that, killing and letting die might make some sort of a morally significant difference. I mean, you don't believe it does, but you can understand how. And you said, treating someone as a mere means might make, a morally significant difference. And I was concerned with, admittedly, I've gotten hooked on Foote's example, of her objection to the doctrine of double effect, right? So that we have this gas, right, that is not going to be killing someone because the death of them is a means to saving the five. It's just going to be this side effect, right? A lot of what I've done is I've tried to preserve my sense that she's right about that, okay? But that it isn't just killing versus letting die. There's something else going on here. So I am hooked on not doing away with some of my intuitions. I say at a certain point, I feel like I'm the princess on the pea. There's something there that's under 50,000 mattresses and it's bothering me. And it just seems like it's my role in life, while the rest of you are, ignoring your intuitions to find something that seems, to say, well, look, maybe we'll lose something. Maybe, I'll work in this area, okay? I'll try to figure out why, this is problematic. And maybe you want to do a brain scan and see that something's wrong with my brain or something. But the thing is that it just did seem to me that even in Foote's case, if I'd asked Foote, I never had the pleasure of asking her, suppose that they, could cure themselves and they breathed normally, you didn't have to use the dangerous gas, but then it moved a gas in the atmosphere. Would that be okay? And my sense is that Foote, would have said, that does seem okay, so maybe there is another distinction here that ought to be attended to. So I think that that's one reason, I'm not willing to give up. Other people do what they can, and I just think it's worth working in the plot that I have. But the means, all right, when I say the means have a bad effect, I still want to distinguish that. This means it has a side effect from the bad thing itself being the means. And I don't think that the way either you or Tom described my principle accounts for that, because toppling the man off the bridge, I would have thought, his falling down in front of a trolley is a very bad thing to have happen to him. And that is the means, right? So it's supposed to be contrasted with the case where, I send a trolley in and the trolley kills someone as a side effect. There, the means is not itself, the turning of the trolley is not itself a bad thing, It has this bad side effect. When you topple someone, the bad thing is itself the means, okay? So, and that's more in the realm of the doctrine of double effect. I just wanted to make that clearer. Now, with respect to some of the stuff that Tom says, the interesting thing for me is in the war things is that I said on that page that you quoted, and here I bring the other little book, right? Because it didn't sound right to me, but who knows what I said. It said, if we were to apply principles of harm that incorporated such distinctions as between greater good leading to the lesser evil as opposed to means to it, I said, if, right, then all the things you said would follow. And then I subsequently said, this is not a distinction recognized in standard just war theory. Elsewhere, I've suggested that just war may introduce factors that alter, and I have other things I'll say at the end, but I'm just going to accept, right? Standard just war theory actually is rather backward. It just accepts the doctrine of double effect, right? It just says that you can go bomb this factory. And here the issue is not that whether it's a greater good or not, okay, but is it the sort of intrinsically good in itself, as you pointed out, right? Maybe only the war being over is good in itself, and this is just a means to it. But the point is, it's some sort of state that justifies these deaths, right? Simply because it's probable that it may lead to the greater ultimate end of the bad people, so forth, stopping fighting. So if you find this state, all right, whether you think of it intrinsic good or not, that will justify the lesser deaths, okay, and it's not an intended death, right, it can just be outweighed by the greater good, right, which would be, I just guess, described as, this factory not existing anymore because it is likely to lead to the end of the war, all right? The point I want to make is that I think Foote has a good objection, that gas case, to the doctrine of double effect. So I think that it's more difficult to explain why we can engage in these collateral harms. Now, I just want to briefly say that one of the things that I say in discussing why war might be different is that I think that the people that we're harming in war do not have the same status as innocent bystanders that we talk about when we talk about like the principle of permissible harm. So, for example, I think that the neutral country people that you mentioned are more inviolable than standard bystanders. I don't think we can redirect a threat that was sent from our enemy to us towards the neutrals, okay? And I don't think that the citizens of our opponent, right, necessarily, though they're not engaged in warlike conduct, they may have responsibilities to bear certain costs in order that their country not be unjust. And that's how they come to be susceptible to side effect harms, all right? So the point that I want to make is that I do think that the current standard, using of doctrine of double effect in just war theory, is not a good idea, and that I have thought about other ways of, accounting for, collateral harm. But I accept, that there is problems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So now, if there are any questions from the audience, please feel free to raise your hand. Before you ask your question, please wait for the microphone since we're trying to record the discussion.
I was intrigued by what Frances said about the lesser good, greater evil kind of cases where she was accepting that it might be permissible, like in a variant of the move to safety case, I take it, for one person to move out of harm's way to the position that would then cause the landslide that kills 5. And I just wanted to hear more about that and how far you'd be prepared to go down that road. I mean, how about a different variant of the case where the one person is in a variant of the move to safety case is it's not in mortal danger but is experiencing pain that will be relieved. Maybe they're there's pressure coming at them if they remain in this one position. But if they move to safety, the structure they can they'll remove this harm, and the removing the harm, the discomfort, relieving the discomfort, also that good brings it about that the landslide occurs and 5 people are killed. That has the same structure of a lesser good, greater evil case, but it starts to seem preposterous to me that would be permissible. But I wonder why not. It seems like it's got the same structure, why isn't that permissible?
Right. Well, I don't know. I mean, I was very surprised when I considered these cases, because it seemed to me that a lot of what I thought could be done on behalf of the 5 and by the 5, right? I did say that, maybe I skipped over, the one would have to have some good justification. He would have to be, I don't think pain is sufficient to avoid it, to do what will cause the death of the 5. It may be the case that you'd have to do some sort of pairwise comparison so that any given individual who would lose their life, you have to see whether what is at stake for you is large enough to make it the case that you could bring that upon the others. And of course, there'll be numbers of others. And the other way to go is to say, well, what if it is death and the other people die, but there are a million of the other people, right? So I don't know where to go with this. It just seemed to me when I was thinking about this that, lo and behold, if the guy could cure his illness, for example, right, and he was going to die if he didn't, and then it would move the germs in the environment, I didn't think that was a reason for him to stop. I thought that it might be a reason for the doctors not to operate, maybe, right? Because then they would be participating in producing this threat to others. And that's why I said, an impartial bystander might not be able to do for the one what the one could do for himself. But no, I agree with you. I don't have any view about what happens when these lesser harms are at stake. But then, one person is in pain, and what will happen if he moves to safety is that 5 people will be in the same amount of pain. Then I'm not so sure, right?
Okay. Marty J.
I want to push a little bit on the issue of the distinction between killing and allowing to die. We're normally told when we write that the active voice is superior to the passive voice, and that when politicians say mistakes were made, rather than saying I made mistakes, they're in some sense weaseling out of their real responsibility. So my moral intuition, as it were, would be that the person who says and takes responsibility for the action I am killing in order to save is in some sense morally superior to the one who, in a more indirect way, says, well, it'll happen, and I'm going to try somehow not to take direct responsibility. So that seems the opposite, in a way, of the sort of direction that your argument is going, if I've understood correctly.
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, I don't want to say that, taking responsibility, there can be different ways of taking responsibility. I don't say, in the way the politician might say, 5 were left to die. It happened that 5 were not saved. I was there. I could have saved them. I take responsibility. I let them die. I did not save them. And then somebody says, well, why didn't you do it? Right? And if I say, well, because, I was a little tired, I didn't feel like stretching out my hand, I will be condemned, okay? But if I say something like, I would have had to topple this fat man in front of the trolley to save them, and I think it would have been wrong to do that. Or on some people's views, even redirecting the trolley would have been wrong. So it isn't that we're not taking responsibility for letting someone die. We're not using that passive voice. The idea is that the question is whether if you own up to the fact that you will be letting someone die, do you have a justification for doing that? And that is taking responsibility for one's actions.
Well, all right. I'll stop there. We'll talk at dinner.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. Brian Berkey in the back in the black V-neck.
Hi. So I hope I'm getting this right. This sort of went by a little quickly in your talk, Francis. So you said at one point that
it won't sound as good slow as it did fast, I'm sure.
Well, we'll see. We'll see if I can even if I can even remember it quite right. But you were saying in discussing the the lesser good, greater evil cases, that you think that there are certain cases in which a bystander is obligated to step in and rescue one, even though downstream of that, 5 will be killed. I don't remember if it was, the trolley that will kill the 5, or if, the trolley will dislodge some rocks or whatever it might be. And this intuition struck me as quite puzzling, that a bystander could have this obligation, especially when we sort of put it alongside the intuition in the sort of standard trolley case, which is that it's at least permissible for a bystander to sort of step in and sort of redirect a threat.
Right. So I just want to point. Good. I guess I do want to stand by what I said, whether it's done in slow motion or said in fast motion, because the idea is that. All right, so the way I put it in the section of the paper that I didn't have time to read to explain it was that, ordinarily you would save that one person. Here's just, a gloss on this. If there weren't 5 behind them and the trolley were coming out, easy for you to do, or you should save that person, right? The fact that his death, or his being hit by the trolley, which will be, he's being crushed, is useful to other people is not a reason not to save him. Now, here's a case, all right, which is not exactly like this one, because in this one, he was protecting them, and now they're going to be subject to a threat they weren't before. But my view is that the only reason they weren't subject to the threat was that he was in this role that he doesn't have to occupy of saving them. Okay, so take the transplant case, which is a little bit different. Okay, maybe simpler to see. There's this one person who has these healthy, has these organs, right? And he's going to be chopped up to save the 5, all right? But now suppose you take a different case where there's someone who is dying, all right, and his organs will be available. This is a real medical ethics case, right, to save the 5. And all of a sudden you find a cure for his disease, right? You could have saved the 5 quite legitimately, right, with these organs because the guy was going to die. You cannot refuse to give him this cure for his disease simply because, oh my God, we won't have the organs available to save the 5 anymore. I think that would be wrong to do. Okay? And now, in this case, the 5 were already threatened with their own illnesses, so it's not like by removing the good that he could do for them, you expose them to another threat. Okay? That's why I say it's a little different. But I'm trying to do this because it may help you with what I'm saying. Okay? Now, this is all compatible with it being the case that if you had to decide, suppose you have 5 patients in one hospital and this other one in one hospital, and you discover the cure for this one person's disease, right? But you have an independent way of saving the 5. I think you should stay and save the 5 and let the one die. But that's not a case where you're saving the 5 by omitting to help the one because you need something of their organs. No, you have a completely different other way of saving the 5. You're busy doing that, and you can't go and save the one. So I think it's all consistent. Does that make it better? Does it at least make it less puzzling to you what I'm claiming?
Yeah, I see the thought behind it.
Okay, thank you.
I'll stop there. Thanks.
Okay, terrific. I can see that there are still some other questions, but I hope that you'll save them from tomorrow when we'll have some brief introductory remarks from our speakers and then an open discussion, which you'll be invited to join. In the meantime, let's thank Frances and her commentators for a very stimulating discussion today.